last week was our skills building week, and this week we have, you know, you're on the run towards home, don't you, towards the exam, when you've got to scroll all the way down in Moodle to get to the week that you're on. Okay, so the week 7 tutorial question does not have an animated video. What you needed to do was read the hammer and barrow case and then discuss with me. I mean, the actual set piece was to write out an RX style answer to the question of, here. Imagine that you're representing the Coca-Cola company in the circumstances of Hammer and Barrow. At the time, Hammer and Barrow have supplied their first round of yo-yos, and Coca-Cola isn't happy and they want to terminate the contract on the basis of anticipatory breach. So that was the set piece for this evening. Has anyone managed to do an IRAC at all? Wait, let me back up. Let me back up. Has anyone managed to read the case? It's going to be a short shoot. Some yes, some no. Some people still eating dinner. No, not yet. Started. Okay. All right. Well, what we might do is we will go and do a bit of revision on our, do a little bit of revision on termination. Who has managed to read the text on termination? I'm not waving a stick here, by the way. I need to know where to pitch the tutorial. A lot of people, a lot of no's starting that too. Okay, all right, so we'll pitch it fairly low this evening. I'll let you flesh out your understanding. Seems like there's almost no one that's done the readings. Aim for the gutter. Okay. Is there anyone in the tute that has done the readings? Can I have a yes? Anyone that has read the text? Mm-hmm. Yeah, the case was yo-yos. Okay, I'm not quite sure. I mean, apart from providing you with another mini lecture, that's going to make things challenging. Lecture away. All right, well, I shall get rid of this document because we're not going to need it, and I will bring over my completed document because obviously, you know, I'm not going to be throwing to you guys if you haven't managed to read the text yet. So here comes another lecture on termination. I read the study guide, but not the casebook. Oh, okay. Yay! Thanks, Sam. Woo! Woot, woot! 10 gold stars and a brownie point for you. Please talk to me at any stage, Sam. A question from JJHP360. I have a question. When we're generally interpreting the legislation that applies, do we approach it from cases in Queensland by default? I'm in New South Wales. I think so. JJHP360. Sorry, what was your name so I can give you a name? Jay. Okay. Jay, that sounds to me like an assignment question. Is that correct? Yeah. All right. We've had a reasonably lengthy discussion about assignment stuff, so I might bookmark that potential question, and I'll come round to it at the very end of the tute. Is that all right? Sweet. Yeah, we need to kind of march on with this stuff. Now, the stuff that we do this evening, wow, this week and next week, I would strongly suggest that you revise very, very carefully for at the end of term, if you know what I mean. Kind of unfortunate that people have a whole lot of stuff going on and couldn't read the text before you came this evening, because I think you probably would have got more out of it if you had done so. And like I said, it's a bit unfortunate because this stuff is prime pickings for the exam. So last week, and I will touch on a bit of a recap of the doctrine of substantial performance and entire contracts, divisible contracts. I'll touch on that at the end of this evening's tute, because we spent last week doing skills building, and I don't want to leave you without some guidance on that stuff. But I will strongly suggest that for next week, and let's see, for next week and the week after, and unfortunately for you also this week, are really prime areas for examinable topics. So in order to get the best that you can out of a tutorial, I mean, I'm happy to sit here and lecture again about this stuff, but the point is I've got videos up online for you. And so it's going to be a bit of boring double handling for you to go back, watch my videos, blah, 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 and then have to sit through another hour this evening. And we could have had a much more sophisticated discussion if you had managed to at least get over the text for me. The point of a flipped classroom model, and I'm sure that you're aware of this already, but I'm sure that every other lecturer says to you, so I'm sure a lot of people's eyes are glazing over, but I will say it again, you will get a lot more out of the tutorials if you do come with some preparation. I know that tends to, it's the middle of term hump, you've got a lot of assignments that are hitting you, and there's a lot of reading to be done. And kind of the tute preparation falls away. But I would really encourage you to try and keep up with your tutorial preparation, because if you let that stuff slide, then when it comes to week 11, week 12, it's going to hit you like a tidal wave. And there are a lot of people that won't be able to swim that hard, that fast at the end of term. So I would really encourage you, if you can, and I know that everyone's inwardly rolling their eyes, but the point is, I just want to give you a bit of a heads up, because this stuff that's happening in the next few weeks is going to be super important. I know the assignment has been released, but I guess if you take a grand plan view of things, the assignment is 30%. And the end of term exam is 50%. And this that we're paddling in now and the next couple of weeks is, as I said, prime stuff for that 50% piece of assessment. So this is a motherly call for you all to, try and come prepared. Biggest part of my notes was to understand the difference between a condition and a warranty. Oh, really? Are other people still kind of struggling with that contract A stuff? The difference between a condition and a warranty? Some people are confident. Is anyone else kind of struggling? Oh, okay. Yes. Well, let us do a little bit of revision, and we'll spend the session. And please, Samantha, don't ever think that any question is a silly question. This is precisely why we're here. And, you know, there's not going to be a whole lot of point us going through that hammer and barrow case if no one's really, well, a lot of people haven't read it. We'll get to it, I'm sure, this evening. I mean, we've got another half hour or so, but I'm more than happy to do a little bit of revision. And here it is. You couldn't have segued that any better if I paid you. First thing to remember, party can terminate at common law for breach of condition. Okay, so that magical thing called a condition, if the other party does not jump over that hurdle, then you may leave the race. That is, you may say, that's it, we're going no further. Now, the thing that I immediately want to flag before we even go there for you, termination. Termination. Now, I say this in my Contract A video. One of my Contract A videos. There are many of them. But if you didn't have me for Contract A, there are a couple of things I'm really fussy about. Firstly is the difference between void contracts, void ab initio, and voidable contracts. Okay? Obvious differences there, particularly if you are the third party purchaser at the end of the transactional line. Okay, after the first assignment, you should all be crystal clear on the difference between void and voidable contracts. Terminating and repudiating and rescission, and particularly termination and rescission, are often used interchangeably. I'll go on to discuss repudiation in just a moment because it's something quite different. We need to understand the difference between that as well. But termination chops a contract off dead at the moment you terminate. So if you imagine a contract like a snake, it's slithering along quite happily, and then all of a sudden someone sees it's a brown snake and with the shovel, bang, severs that contract. I don't know if you've ever seen this done, but often these separate parts will squiggle away. That's what termination is. Everything that's happened up to that point, big browns. So you can relate to that analogy. Everything that's happened up to that date stays on foot. Nothing goes away. So if a date for payment of some sum occurred, rightfully so, under that contract the day before you terminate, that obligation to pay still stands because that whole half of the contract before you terminate stands. It's only cut off for the future. Okay? Crucial, crucial, crucial. Tell me then, how is that different to rescission? This should also be crystal clear in your minds after the assignment.
Because rescission is an unstitching, like
yes,
taking it back. So terminating is not taking it back.
Exactly. Rescission, the whole point of rescission is to unravel that contract right to the very beginning. Restitutio in integrum is that order that the court makes. That's right, Paris. Unpicks exactly, unravels it back exactly. Everything gets unwound as much as is humanly possible to get that substantial restitutio happening. Okay, and that's where, generally speaking, all you're going to get is your out-of-pocket expenses, because you're meant to be restored to that pre-contractual position financially, as much as damages and orders can do it. Okay. Termination leaves everything on foot up to that moment. Please get those two concepts really firmly in your mind, because many judges don't. Okay. It's only fussy law lecturers like us that, you know, get really picky about this stuff. So some of the cases that you will read start to interchange rescission and termination. Now you need to have those two terms crystal clear in your head, so that when some judge starts talking about rescission, you go, oh, poor love, they actually mean termination, or vice versa. Okay, so please get those two concepts super straight. Terminating at common law for breach of condition, we have our lovely Associated Newspapers and Banks test. Remember the newspaper case with Ginger Megs? Yeah, that's it. In my Contract A lectures, I think I managed to hunt down some of the comic strips, and I think I put them in there somewhere in the videos for you. And poor old Mr. Banks wanted his cartoons on the front page, didn't he? And he specifically contracted to have his cartoons on the front page. Most prestige, most readership, best familiarity with your audience, most fame, I guess. But he contracted that into the terms so that he was assured of performance by the other party. And if that other party didn't perform, well, he would never have gotten into that contract in the first place. That was so important for him. He would never have contracted without that term. And that's the hallmark of a condition, okay? You look at the contract as a whole, or it might be apparent from one particular term or terms, that the promise is so important that the promisee wouldn't have entered into the contract unless they were assured of a strict or at least substantial performance of that promise, and that was apparent to the other party. Does that make more sense? So it's pretty darn crucial. All right. Yeah, no worries. Now, a warranty is anything else. So, well, that's not quite true, because there's intermediate terms or innominate terms. They are what look like warranties, but in actual fact, when they're breached, the disastrous nature of the consequences from the breach might actually indicate that it should be treated as a condition rather than a warranty. But that's Hong Kong Fur, and we've no need to really revise that. Hong Kong Fur, Jay, is the case I'm thinking of. That was the ship case, the seaworthiness case. Don't know if that's ringing any bells. Where seaworthiness was one of the terms. Yes. Okay. So, and the court said seaworthiness, you know what? You could breach that by having, you know, a nut in the floor loose. You know, so it could be something as inconsequential as that, or it could be a great big, you know, gaping hole in the side of the ship. And where there is a term like that, you don't know whether it's going to be how it should be treated. They say look to the consequences. Okay. Was seaworthy for a period of the contract? Yes, and it was rather unfortunate, because the people that were in control of the engineering department and whatnot had a bit of a drinking problem. and the ship was consistently late for a whole heap of things. But yeah, that was Hong Kong Fur. So in terms of termination, the test of essentiality we've done. If the time for performance hasn't yet occurred, but here a party indicates that they are unwilling or unable to perform, we call that an anticipatory breach. Okay, anticipatory breach. That can happen in a number of ways, and we will explore those in just a moment. But in for and in white, this is why I called the Moodle page this week the dance of performance, because I think this case is kind of the best example ever. But, you know, they had this contract for the sale and purchase of land. They had to register a right of way before the settlement date. 2 days before the settlement date, the seller says, sorry, can't actually register that right of way. You won't be able to sell on the settlement date. And at that point, what has happened? Two things. We can't give you the promised right of way, and we won't be able to attend settlement. And that is a prime example of an anticipatory breach. Okay, time for performance hasn't yet happened, but you get a communication from one party or the other that they're not going to be able to do whatever it is they've said they will do. When you enter into a contract, the best guide of how you have to perform is that you have to be ready, willing, and able to perform all of your contractual obligations as and when they crop up. Ready, willing, and able. Obviously, they indicated that they would not be able, and so the purchasers didn't come to settlement. And then a couple of days later, they got kind of ticked off with the whole situation, purported to terminate then. The seller then says, hang on a minute, you can't terminate now because you yourself didn't turn up to settlement. So you can see it's like a dance, isn't it? And the purchasers said, oh, hang on a minute, you're the one that stuffed up to start with. And then the whole dispute got very ugly and it all went up to the High Court. And the High Court said, I'll leave you to read the case note, but eventually, you know, the purchasers were in the right there. They ended up terminating for actual breach for the vendor's failure to complete on the settlement date. I'll leave you to explore that, but that's kind of a nice little example of how heated things get when you start talking about termination. The other way, if you're not talking about breach of a condition, you might terminate for triggering of a contractual provision that allows you to terminate, okay? Contracts commonly say, if you don't do X, we will be able to terminate. No real rocket science to that, but the big, there's two things to note about that. The termination has to be justified at common law, and by that I mean it has to be either a breach of condition or a repudiation of the contract. I'll talk about that in just a second. Otherwise, you cannot get damages for lost bargain. And here is the gold mine of a difference between rescission and termination, okay? If you let that contract stay on foot and there's a breach or there's a condition in the contract that lets you get out for the other party's wrongdoing, you don't get out-of-pocket damages, and we'll be doing damages very shortly, won't we? Not next week, the week after. You get expectation damages, and this is the beauty of contract law over tort law. Expectation damages, the measure there is that you will be put into the position as if the contract had been performed. If you expected to make $100,000 in your pocket after tax out of that contract, and you can successfully terminate for the other party's breach or because of a condition that's let you do so because of the other party's breach or some kind of conduct, then you will be able to get that $100,000 worth of profit. A lot of difference, because imagine if you were a builder and you'd started the contract and you'd been knocking back all of these other contracts potentially because you've entered into this one to build a house. Say you've only ordered $23,000 worth of materials and you've started, you poured the foundations and whatnot. If you only got the tortious measure, you'd get you $23,000. If you can sue for a contractual lost bargain, expectation damages, you will get your full 100 grand profit. there is, like I said, the gold mine of a difference between termination and rescission. Okay, so if you want to get those gold mine damages, you've got to be able to justify, okay? You have to be able to show a court there's been a breach of condition or a repudiation. Now, obviously, if you're going to terminate under a contractual provision, you've got to do every darn thing that that contract says that you've got to do. If you've got to provide them notice with 23 days advance notice before something or other happening, and then you'll terminate, then you'll send another terminate, because often you have to send a notice of breach first. You have to give them so many days to fix whatever it is up, and then you'll be able to, if there is a process, you must follow the process to the T. Okay, Commonwealth and AMAN, I will leave you to explore that. You did touch on it very briefly in contract A, so that'll be a little bit of revision for you there. Big disaster for the Commonwealth in that case. Repudiation. Repudiation of a contract. Now remember, I said you have to be ready, willing and able to perform your contractual obligations as they arise. Repudiation means it might not be like a breach of a specific condition, like we just talked about with Associated Newspapers and Banks, but the other party has somehow indicated to you that they are no longer ready and willing, I guess you would lump those together, or they are not able to complete the contract anymore. Now, if that is the case, that is a naughty, naughty no-no, okay? That gives you then the ability to get out, call it quits, and potentially sue them for loss of bargain damages. Test there is whether a reasonable person in the other party's situation would see the conduct as a renunciation of the whole contract or a fundamental obligation under it. It's got to be very clear. Okay, so if you think of the foreign and white situation, you know, the right of way, land and purchase and sale, in that kind of thing, the indication that you just can't do something crucial that the contract requires of you, that will be a repudiation. Okay, there are differences, there are nuances, as there always are with this stuff. Unwillingness. Basically, the contract just doesn't suit me anymore, and you know, I'm sorry, but you know, I want to pull out now, would be an example. Okay, or the test that they used in Progressive Mailing House might not be as clear as that. That through their conduct or through a series of events that they have manipulated, they have shown they intend to fulfill the contract in a manner substantially inconsistent with their obligations and not in any other way. Substantially inconsistent with their obligations and not in any other way. If they show a shilly-shallying attitude, I love that. Or I love alliterations also. Procrastination persistently practiced. Say that underwater with a mouthful of marbles. Okay? So the kind of conduct that really, you know, flips the bird at you, so to speak, colloquially. I was clearly trying to wake up the courtroom there. So sometimes unwillingness is shown by the other party's delay. And here's where we get the whole lovely turgid discussion in the text about delay. And we have this little thing called open contracts. And open contracts, unfortunately, don't specify the time or date for performance of an obligation. So they're a little bit fuzzy. And please, 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 if it's one thing that you take away from this week's excursion when you are later on in practice and drafting up stuff that people actually have to live their lives by, please, wherever you can put dates in to a contract, do so. Or at least time frames, 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, 7 days. The more specific that you can be with your drafting, the better off people will be, particularly your client. Okay, the more specific you can be, the greater confidence the parties will have when they're dealing with each other. Okay, if time's not of the essence, and the magical word to make time of the essence, that means of the essence means it's legal jargon for please, if you are a judge, put a red flag here, because this is a condition of the contract and any breach will allow my client to terminate. Okay, use those magical words, of the essence. Time is of the essence, and that is the legal formulation that will indicate to a judge that you are serious about timeframes here. So if time's not of the essence and it is an open contract, then unfortunately a failure to perform on time doesn't entitle the innocent party to terminate. Before you can terminate, there's this, for an open contract I'm talking about, here's the protracted, dance that has to go on, where party X has an obligation to Y. If you want the other party to perform, you first have to wait a reasonable time. Oh dear, how long is a reasonable time? Who knows? It's going to take you at least 7 days of court time to work that one out, and by then you're probably about $100,000 down in barrister's fees. Okay, wait that first reasonable time, and after a reasonable time has elapsed, you can serve a notice to complete. But even then, no, you cannot terminate immediately. What you must do is you have to say what the other party has to do. You have to put in a time frame that they have to do it. And then you have to say what the consequences are. 2 more magical phrases: may terminate. And another one: reserve my client's rights. Okay, have a look at Luinda and Lace for that. After that notice has been served and after that date in your notice has elapsed, you have to wait that reasonable time until that date has elapsed. And then if there's no compliance, you can terminate. Now, interestingly, think back to contract A. We probably won't have time to skip on to hammer and barrow, but we can if you wish. I'll just finish my thought here. A contract is formed when both parties are at consensus ad item, right? So how can serving a notice to complete midway into a contract make a term like time essential? How can a notice after the contract has started make time a condition? The short answer is it can't. What it does do is it sets up the other party as having demonstrated repudiation. They have shown, you have shown them you are darn serious about performing this thing, whatever it is they've got to do. You've waited a first reasonable time. You've waited a second reasonable time. And they still haven't done what you've asked. Therefore, they're repudiating is your inference. Okay? Because you've made it clear you'll terminate if they don't do what they're meant to be doing. So that is the difficult dance where you have an open contract. Now, can you get fed up with someone and serve a notice to complete that asks them to do everything the next day? No, you can't. Because the date within that notice to complete has to be reasonable. Okay. All right, that's unwillingness, inability to perform. There are 2 versions of this. Oh, before I move on to that, I mean, I'm sure that this is in the lectures. Would you want to just keep on discussing this stuff? Or would you like to go on to the have a quick discussion on Hammer and Barrow? I mean, I think if you've got a Hammer and Barrow, okay. So express inability to perform we have, and implied inability to perform. Hammer and Barrow was more of a case of implied inability to perform, was it not? Okay, so that means someone has not said expressly to you, I'm not going to perform. They have said by their actions that they won't perform. And there I need you to look at almond investors and koala tree. Okay, so there's express and implied inability to perform. Hammer and Barrow, the facts were Coca-Cola placed an order with Hammer and Barrow to make 200,000 yo-yos. The yo-yos were to be distributed to retailers and used as promotional items. There was an ad campaign associated with the rollout of the yo-yos. The first batch, we got $85,000. They were dollars, 85,000 yo-yos. They were sent to Auckland, and in fact, Coca-Cola directed that they be delivered to Northern Bottlers, who were an agent for Coca-Cola at that point. 80% of the yo-yos were defective. Now, at that point, they still had another 115,000 yo-yos to be manufactured. Okay, Coca-Cola refused acceptance, rejected the goods, and purported to terminate for anticipatory breach, we just talked about. Okay. Hammer and Barrow said, hang on a minute, under various different pieces of legislation, we think that they should pay us for what we've delivered, these 85,000. Okay. Two issues. Could Coca-Cola terminate for anticipatory breach? And could they reject the goods that had already been delivered? In terms of termination for anticipatory breach, they said here, on the basis, they'd repudiated on the basis of the inability of Hammer and Barrow to complete the contract because they had delivered 85,000, of which 80% were defective. So it's not an express repudiation, that is, we will not perform this condition of the contract. It was implied by the circumstances. Yeah, they sent them the yo-yos, but 8 out of 10 were no good, right? Court held that Coca-Cola could rescind for anticipatory breach because of that horrendous ratio that the breach bore to the contract as a whole, and because the breach occurred very early on and there was no evidence led that Hammer and Barrow could pick up the game. Okay. There are a few other things that factored in there. Could Coca-Cola reject the goods already delivered? Hammer argued that Coca-Cola could not reject the yo-yos delivered to Auckland. That is to their agent. It said title had passed Coca-Cola because it sent them to their agent, and they said under the sale of goods legislation in New Zealand, title passed if after delivery the purchaser does any act inconsistent with ownership. Okay, and they said by giving the goods to their agent, they'd effectively accepted that delivery and therefore should be held liable to pay for it. Yes? I'll leave you to read all of that stuff. Are you with me so far? Everyone's turned their vision off and I'm just hearing nothing. There's crickets and tumbleweed out there. Didn't they pay the first invoice as well? You're talking about Hammer and Barrow and Coca-Cola? Yeah, they did accept some of those, and their agents actually did send 51 cartons off to retailers. So basically they'd said this whole 40% of the contract's been performed, you've got your goods, and some cartons have been sent on to retailers. Doesn't that mean you've accepted that whole batch? Little QC. Oh, quality control. I thought you meant Queen's Counsel. Yeah, not much in the way of quality control. So you can see the argument that's been made. Now, did you manage to do the readings for last week? Anyone? Woohoo! Okay, so we had a look at performance last week, did we not? Entire contracts, divisible, divisible contracts, the doctrine of substantial performance. So you might have been thinking while you were going through that, there is a bit of a tendency with that kind of stuff, because that was fairly dry material in the sense of, you know, you're looking at a 1950s High Court case that talks about, you know, cutting down firewood to the right and trimming it to the right lengths and stuff like that, and whether or not that was an entire contract or a divisible contract. And, but here you see those doctrines in all their glory, do you not? Because essentially Hammer and Barrow is saying, you know, we've given you all this stuff, and you should be treating what we've delivered to you as an entire delivery. And because some of that stuff's been accepted, well, you've got to pay us for the whole 40%, yes? Is the kind of argument that's been set up, along with, you know, the sale of goods legislation argument. And here, the judge goes through the circumstances very nicely. The original contract between Coke and Hammer provided for delivery as manufactured. Whatever ambiguity existed in this expression was, I think, resolved by the conduct of the parties when deliveries commenced. And from the schedule of deliveries, consignments were dispatched on various dates, and each consignment was followed up by a separate invoice. What's that sounding like? An entire contract or a divisible contract? Yes. Thanks, Megan. Divisible. So what does that do? How does that advance Coke's argument? It advances Coke's argument because if each little invoice for each delivery could be considered one further chunk of the contract, each divisible part of the contract itself is like a little mini entire contract, right? So they might have accepted some, but they could reject the rest. Yes? Some they had accepted, yes. But others, most, they hadn't. 97 cartons. So they accepted 51, and there was 97 cartons. Rejection had taken place within a reasonable time. There was no inconsistent dealing with that would suggest they relinquished ownership. They made timely complaint. And not only did that happen, but in the face of all of that, Hammer and Barrow did nothing. And so the goods could be returned. Okay? Is that the principle behind continuing contracts? Ooh, no, that's an employment issue. That's an employment issue.
Hey AJ, I think you've answered the question, but just to clarify, the difference between the Hammer and Barrow case being anticipatory breach and not inability is because it was, the contract could be divided into sections. That's what differs it between the almond investor and the nursery case, where it was very similar in that so many items were not deliverable or they weren't up to scratch, but that whole case could be held, the contract could be held, the termination, sorry, could be held valid. Is that because it wasn't a divisible contract?
This whole contract could be terminated, and that in fact is what happened. So we're talking about anticipatory breach. Okay, there's a couple of different fights that are going on in this case. The first fight is, can we please terminate the whole contract? We don't want to be involved with these jokers anymore. They've sent us 40% of what we ordered, and 80% of that is rubbish, right? So we are inferring from that conduct they will not be able to complete their obligations for the rest of the contract. So we're chopping off that contract right here. Do you see what I mean? So as far as the umbrella of the whole contract goes, the grand argument, if you will, is we've got to this point, we've had enough, that's it. We're not going to deal with these people anymore. And on that point, yes, they could terminate for anticipatory breach, because the conduct itself, an 80% rejection rate, 80% breach rate, the fact that they had delivered that many goods with that much of a breach ratio meant that it was practically impossible that they were going to be able to fulfill the rest of the contract as it's specified and when it's specified, the yo-yos to be delivered. Other pressures were at play here. There was a really super expensive ad campaign, and so there was time pressure. If they didn't get these yo-yos quickly enough, they wouldn't get them out to the shops. If they didn't get them out to the shops, it wouldn't be out fresh in everyone's mind. Oh, well, while I'm buying my milk this week, I'll pick up a yo-yo from a kid. Do you know what I mean? So there was the value of the advertising campaign. There was also reputational issues. I don't know if you ever have lived through one of these campaigns. I certainly did in the 70s. And that was all the thing. Everyone bought Coke because it was so cool. And the yo-yos were sold like right in the same shop, you know, and everyone was learning how to do the walk the dog and the round the world and all of that stuff. And it was a reputational thing. So there was a number of different points of pressure here. And Coca-Cola, I think very rightly said, we've got this ad campaign. This is all fresh in everyone's minds. We're kind of right in the middle of things. We can't stay with you now and hope that your quality will improve. So on the broader argument, they terminated for anticipatory breach, okay, for repudiation, implied inability to perform, like koala tree. Does that make sense? The other fight that they were having is payment. Should we get payment for the goods already delivered? Or could they be rejected? And that's the part of the deal where they had to go into the analysis. Well, do you consider that 40% an entire chunk of the contract, such that acceptance of one bit necessarily means they've accepted the whole darn lot? Or can you say what has been performed thus far? It's a bit like an autopsy, isn't it? It's like that poor old snake that we were talking about. You've terminated, okay, it's got rid of it for the future, but now we have to dissect. It's rather morbid, isn't it? Now we have to dissect what's gone wrong and who gets what. Okay? Hoping that does make sense. The only other thing I wanted to discuss was here. Inferring repudiation is very tricky. Normally you won't have... Megan's just segued in. I know that we're a few minutes over time. If you've got a few minutes to stick with me, stick with me. If you don't, that's fine. Catch the video and ciao for now. But Megan has just said, is this a substantial performance contract? 10 gold stars for you and a brownie point. I want to talk about substantial performance, and we'll do that in just a second. Couldn't have segued better if I'd paid you. Inferring repudiation is very, very tricky, and you want to be on really, really super duper solid ground whenever you think about doing this with your client, because the risk is, and here's the sting in the tail with repudiation. Sounds great, but if your client is the type that's a bit of a hothead and they've just gotten annoyed with the other party, and the other party's conduct is not, legally speaking, severe enough to actually constitute repudiation, they haven't shown themselves. Here, look at our test. I'm a visual learner too. Up here. Finally, wholly, there we go. Wholly and finally disabled. Wholly and finally disabled from performing. Okay? If it's not that serious and you try and repudiate, what has your client then just said to the other party? If they get ticked off and go, hey, I'm going to take that as a repudiation, I'm going to accept that repudiation and terminate and sue you for damages for the lost bargain. If that conduct does not legally constitute a repudiation, what has your client now done? Someone tell me. I'm waiting. I'm looking at the chat box. You've repudiated. Your own client has repudiated. You have to be absolutely sure that the conduct you are repudiating for actually constitutes repudiation as far as the law would be concerned. If not, and you purport to accept that repudiation and terminate, if you terminate without sufficient justification, that will be a wrongful termination. And what's repudiation? Wrongful termination. So now your client's in the hole that he was trying to get out of, or she. Yes, exactly, Jay. By getting ticked off too quickly and saying, yeah, I'm going to take that as repudiation and I'm going to terminate, you have just said, I am going to terminate without basis. Therefore, you yourself have, yes, demonstrated they're unwilling. Makes sense. So you got to be real super duper clear on that stuff. There's a lot at stake. I will leave you. Here's the beautiful IRAC that I would like you to do. If pigs might fly, people are saying. Please try and do this. If there's one thing that came out of your assignments, it is that many, many, many people would benefit from weekly IRAC practice. So please, if you have 15, 20 minutes each week, type out an answer and send it to me. It's worth it. Argument construction is a core skill. That was just an advertisement there. Shameless, I know, but anyway. So, Megan said, is this a substantial performance contract? Have a look at that. So, what if we said, in terms of the hammer and barrow situation, Coca-Cola has to retain and pay for the first batch of yo-yos. We delivered 40% of the items to you. This was one entire part of the contractually stipulated number. You accepted some. You have to pay us for the lot. This is where we get into the entire and divisible analysis, which we've just been through. And remember the magical words. It won't be an entire contract unless we see those magical words. So payment will be predicated on a condition precedent, and that condition precedent will be performance of the whole contract. Exactly. If the whole contract must be performed exactly, and you will not get payment until that has been performed. The magical word will be payment is contingent upon the promisor doing X or Y, sorry, the promisee doing X or Y or Z. Okay, that will indicate an entire contract. Remember poor old Cutter and Powell, the seaman that contracted to go on a rather long journey and died about 6 weeks into the journey. His executrix sued for payment for wages, and they denied him payment of any of that 6 weeks worth of wages because the contract was entire. He had to perform the whole of his duties until arrival at port, and he did not do so. Okay, contract was entire, no right to payment unless the whole thing was done exactly. Okay, divisible contract we've already looked at with hammer and barrow. If you can chop that contract up into little pieces. And then if it's not an entire contract, it will be a divisible contract. And in terms of payment, as I said, each several portion is its own mini entire contract, and you have to substantially perform that part of the contract. What is the doctrine of substantial performance? Who's read Hennig and Isaacs? Anyone? I guess you said you didn't really have a chance to go and read. I would recommend that you will need to know about that case at some point after week 12. It comes with a bookend brethren of a case. Here we are. BoultonMaher Diva. You must know these cases. Okay. I call them bookend cases. They show you very clearly what substantial performance is all about. In Hennig and Isaacs, we had a promise to refurbish a flat, and there was various work that had to be done. You know, bookshelves had to be constructed, wardrobe doors, painting for a lump sum. However, Lord Denning works his magic there and says, notwithstanding that this is a contract for a lump sum, I don't think just because there's one price tag for all these little bits and pieces that have to be done, I don't think that that lump sum figure necessarily makes this contract an entire contract. Okay, I think that unless we have that precise formulation of payment being contingent upon the whole performance of the contract exactly, then I'm not going to treat it as an entire contract. And the subcontractor was entitled to get their money back because the cost of rectification was only about 10% of the contract price. Yeah, so Denning's like, yeah, what are you sweating about? Really? The person who moved in was already living there too. Yeah. Ah, so you did know this. See, you should have shouted out. So Denning's like, don't sweat the small stuff. This person has to be paid. It wouldn't be right if you got to have the whole of basically the contract enjoyed for free from this person. Yes, they've, you know, stuffed up, but it's only about 10%. You've got to pay them everything minus that 10%, because the flat owner had gotten fed up and had gone to somebody else to get the stuff repaired. So where they've had to pay out money to get the job up to what was originally specified, then the contractor had to say, okay, well, if he's had to pay that amount, that's fine. I'll get everything that I was entitled to, less the amount it's cost to fix everything up. BoultonMaher Diva, the cost of rectification was 30% of the price. And there, it was no go, no recovery of the contract price, no substantial performance, no recovery of contract price. Okay, BoultonMaher Diva was an unfortunate case of installing a water heater, didn't work properly, gave out fumes into living rooms. That was obviously a fairly major defect, and because of that, no recovery, as I said. So good bookend cases, one polar extreme, one at the other polar extreme. And it helps you work out where the benchmarks are. The Wilmot text goes into the greater nuances of all of that. Have a read of the rest of my notes for this week if you like, but I would strongly suggest that you get to know those cases quite well and this doctrine quite well. Queries, questions? Sorry, it wasn't as interactive this evening. Kind of felt like I was Queries?
AJ, I have another question.
Yes.
With those two cases, is one of the big factors also livability? Like the issues in the first one, Hoeing and Isaac, were bookcase and like things that kind of sit in your house but aren't necessities, whereas the other one was water heater and fumes and went into like just how they're living. And I think also, like you said, the percentage. So is that something important in substantial performance? That if it's something that like interferes with your life?
It's not necessarily the human impact, because unfortunately contract courts aren't terribly interested in that, unfortunately. It's more about the dollar value and about the contractual term, the precise contractual term that's been breached. So it's more what is the magnitude of breach and what does that do for what the party gets overall in terms of what they expected to get from that contract. Does that make sense? So we'll talk about if the defect is minor. This is the Hennig example, okay? Where the defect's minor, so there is you focus on what is the obligation that's at stake and how much of the contractual benefit are you still getting. If the defect's fairly minor and you're still getting the bulk of the contract, it's only going to cost you about 10% difference to fix it up to standard, to what was originally promised, then it's more than likely you'll be able to recover your price. However, as you can tell, this is almost like how long's a piece of string, because there's so many different variables that could go into this kind of thing. But if the nature of the defect is serious, okay, so it's more likely to rob you of really what it was you expected to get from the contract. Another rule of thumb, 33%. There is your 33% is your Boulton measure, okay? If you're hitting those kinds of figures, you won't be able to recover your purchase price. And then it all shades into shades of grey. If the defect is minor, but it costs more than 10%, recovery may be allowed subject to rectification cost. Where a defect is serious, but the cost is small. This is what Wilmot says. It's difficult to predict. Don't you love that when they just throw up their hands? It really is a case-by-case analysis, as I said. I hope that makes a little more sense. Anyway.
Yes, it does.
Cool. Have a look at the notes if you have queries. Once you've managed to catch up and kind of digest everything, please shoot me an email or post up something on Facebook or put something in the discussion forum. There was a question from Jay, but that kind of related to the assignment. So I'm just going to stop sharing now.